That sounds good. Okay. So, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Brandon Millspaw, and I'm a staff psychologist over at the Student Counseling Service here at Miami University. And today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about something that probably seems like an impossible task, something that literally you never thought you could do, and that's staying healthy during graduate school, okay? So we're going to do that by talking about a couple different things. So one of the things we're going to talk about, like when we talk about trying to stay healthy in grad school, is we're mainly today talking about mental health. That's my specialty, so that's the thing I want to be able to speak most directly to. We'll touch on a couple physical health things, but mainly we're going to be talking about mental health. So when you talk about staying healthy in grad school, what you're talking about is you're talking about the effects of stress and avoiding burnout. So we're going to start by talking about some of the symptoms of stress and burnout and what can you identify in yourself or those you care about around you that might give you a sense that they're feeling stressed or moving toward burnout. We're going to look at the major causes of stress and burnout in grad school. There will be too many to mention, but we will go over like a fairly decent list of some of those things so you kind of have a sense of where that stress and where that burnout might be coming from. And then we're going to talk about some long-term changes you can make or some long-term strategies to stay healthy. And then we'll sort of transition to some short-term things or things you can do in the here and now to try to bring that stress level down a little bit. So let's go ahead and get started. So I think it's a pretty common experience. I think it's safe to say that almost all graduate students at some point feel stressed, they feel tired, they feel unmotivated. I think that's very common to the grad school experience. Burnout is a little bit more of an extreme version of that. I think sometimes we use burnout interchangeably with some of those terms, but when used in its more technical form, burnout is a far more profound version of feeling stressed and unmotivated and things like that. Burnout is this ongoing sense of weariness, disinterest, and reduced job performance, school performance, so on and so forth, right? So it is a much more long-term, more serious version. But a lot of the symptoms of stress and kind of being worn out can become, in a more extreme version, burnout. So it helps to talk about both because we're basically talking about a lesser and then a more serious version of very similar things. So what are some of the symptoms? Well, the first is just exhaustion. And exhaustion can look a couple different ways, right? So it could be that body exhaustion, that just your body is tired, your mind's okay, and you could still sit down and read a book, but your body's exhausted. So you've been on the go, or you've been teaching a class, you've been working in a lab, or you've been working on your thesis or working on your dissertation, whatever it may be, and just you've been away from home all day and your body just gives out when you get home. Exhaustion could also be mental exhaustion. So your body is fine because maybe you've been sitting in classes all day, or you're at an internship or a prac site or something like that, and your job is primarily sitting. So your body is fine, but mentally you're exhausted. You've been studying, you've been reading articles, you've been writing papers, whatever it may be, and you just can't think anymore. You're not sleepy, but you got to turn your brain off, so to speak, things like that. So exhaustion. Another symptom is feeling overwhelmed. So that's when it feels like your plate is entirely full, or you're trying to juggle and there are just too many things to keep in the air, too many responsibilities, and it just becomes too much. That also seems like a very common experience to graduate school, that there's so many requests on your time and it can lead to that feeling of it's just too much, that overwhelmed feeling. Becoming bitter or cynical. I think this is one that people don't necessarily think about, but one of the symptoms of stress and then ultimately a burnout is to start to notice attitudinal change. So you become sort of cynical about whether it's the grad school process, your department, your cohort, dissertation, your career, whatever it may be. You notice that bitterness or that consistent anger toward things starting to creep in. Like, it's natural to feel angry about things or dislike certain processes from time to time. But that's usually the exception. It's when it becomes the norm and not the exception that you may be noticing a change. Another symptom would be self-doubt or anxiety. I think this is a huge one at the grad level just because the work is harder, the demands are higher, and so anxiety is likely to follow. And that typically grad students are high academic performers. They're smart people, they're good students. And so when the expectations go up, anxiety is a fairly natural response. And sometimes that can lead to self-doubt, especially with that increase in expectation. So if you notice self-doubt or anxiety, similar to one we've already talked about, anger or hostility toward others, that's sort of in that bitter or cynical. For some people, anger looks a little different than bitterness or cynicism. Cynicism can sometimes have kind of a funny tinge to it. Like might be sometimes how people sort of deal with that stress. Whereas anger and hostility presents just more, as you would expect. It's just sort of that aggression kind of a thing. Low self-efficacy or perceived competence. So losing a sense that you can do a thing. So losing a confidence in yourself that you can do a thing. So you get to grad school, you've always been a good writer, and then all of a sudden you start thinking, I don't know if I can do this thesis, or I don't know if I can finish this dissertation, or I've got to write this paper, and I just don't know if my writing's any good. It's been good up to that point, but all of a sudden you're starting to doubt. That could be the result of stress or weariness or a feeling of burnout. Similarly, just a general decreased belief in one's abilities to do one's work, right? So that's, instead of just focusing it in one area like writing, just an overall decrease in belief in oneself is another symptom. Avoidance of people you work with, so classmates, lab mates, people you work with, faculty, advisors, whoever it may be. If you find yourself consistently trying to avoid those people, sometimes that can be a sign that you're starting to experience a lot of grad school related stress, because being around those people, maybe it triggers things for you. So there's this feeling of, well, whenever I'm around my cohort mates, we start talking about our comprehensive exams and it makes me anxious. So it's just better for me to avoid them altogether. That probably gives you a sense or a hint that maybe you might be struggling with some anxiety. You might be struggling with that feeling overwhelmed, and that being around those people who might talk about that might sort of kind of tip the scales, and it might be a little too much. Physical effects. So if you notice a change in your immune system, your endocrine system, your metabolic functioning, things like that, those are the systems in your body that are most impacted by stress. So when you become anxious or you start to feel stress, you start to produce certain hormones. The most famously known one is cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And cortisol interacts with your body in some unpleasant ways, and it tends to impact your immune system, your endocrine system, and things like that first. That's where we see the changes first. So also elevated anxiety, depression, sleep concerns, different mental health concerns can either be caused by, or pre-existing ones can be exacerbated by, things like grad school stress and things like that. And then lastly, the last symptom figured we'd touch on would be poor responsibility management. So generally, as a grad student, most of us are pretty responsible. We're able to make deadlines. We're able to be at places in certain times. And that is certainly super key for grad school, whether it's your instructor for a class, so you have to be there every Tuesday from 3 to 4:30 or whatever it may be, or get your papers in on time and things like that. If you find all of a sudden that that's changing, if it's becoming, it's getting hard to get things done on time, you're starting to show up late, or you're getting close to showing up late, that could certainly be a symptom. So, where do these symptoms come from, right? So, you have a sense of what to look for or what to monitor for, but where are these things coming from? And I think some of the sources of some of these stressors and sources of burnout, I think they kind of fall into two categories. There are some very general ones, and then I think there are some that relate very uniquely to the graduate school experience. Um, I think graduate students experience uh, some difficulties and some challenges that are not entirely shared by, say, their undergraduate counterparts. So let's start with those. So the first of those is work-life balance. I think that graduate students are far more likely to experience work-life balance issues. I think they're more likely to work outside of just their school role. I think they're more likely to have family commitments, and family commitments can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So for each of these, remember when we go through stuff like this, it's a check local listings or mileage may vary situation, in that this can look a lot of different ways. So be mindful for how this might look for you or the people around you. So family commitments could be, maybe someone is married, maybe they have a romantic partner, maybe they have children of their own, or they're about to have children of their own, and things like that. Grad students are far more likely to have kids than undergraduates are. They're far more likely to have spouses or partners and things like that. They might also, family commitments could also be, maybe you have to start caring for your own parents. Maybe your parents have gotten to a point they're having some medical struggles or things like that. And so you become pulled into taking care of them, and that becomes part of your role now. I think that becomes far more likely the further on in your education and the further on in your life that you go. For the work piece and being more likely to work and have to balance that with school, that could look like a job, that could look like an assistantship, that could look like a placement. So whether it's you're doing an internship or a placement for development purposes, whether you're working for your department for an assistantship or something like that, that creates more stress for having to balance your schoolwork and then this other commitment that you have, which is not as common for, let's say, an undergraduate student. I think another one of those concerns that's unique to graduate school is the idea of wearing multiple hats or filling multiple roles in a way that you've never had to before. So, when you're an undergraduate student, you have a lot of the typical roles that you've had most of your life. So you might be a son or daughter, you might be a sibling, you might be a family member, you're probably a friend to some people, and you're a student. And I'm sure people have other roles than just that, but those are sometimes the most common roles that we see. But when you start moving into grad school, you get a very different experience, in that not only are you all of those things, you're a student, but in some cases you might now be an instructor. So it's very possible on a Thursday afternoon that from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, you are the student in one of your classes. And then from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock, you're now the instructor in someone else's class. That can be a very jarring transition. It can be very difficult to take off one hat or to fill one role and then immediately move into another that is very different, very counter to, maybe even feels like the opposite of what you were just doing. And that can be very, very jarring. I think another aspect of that is you may be asked to take on the role of a young professional or a professional in training. So think about med school or practicing graduate psychology studies. At that point, you might start seeing patients or clients and things like that. So now you are going from learning about how to treat someone to being the expert in the room. And I think that that can be a very jarring thing for the role. And I think that goes to the next point that speaks to our next unique challenge, which is when you're an undergraduate, you are a student and you're learning and you're training. When you're a graduate student, you sometimes might struggle with an unclear professional status because you're at practicums, because you're at internships, because of the work that you're doing. You are actually starting your career journey. You're not just preparing for it. So you're simultaneously preparing for your career journey and actually starting your career journey. So much like the multiple hats and the multiple roles we talked about, that can be very jarring. It can also be very confusing. What are you? Are you a trainee? Are you a professional? Are you both? And what does that mean? That can be extremely stressful. So, and that's something that undergraduates or others just don't really experience in the same way that graduates do. I think another big one, and I think this one can be particularly huge for people, are boundary issues. Graduate students feel to me like they're never off the clock. So when you move into your career, and it depends on the career, again, this is another mileage may vary, like it's different for every person. So this is not a hard and fast rule, but generally, when you start working, it becomes a situation of, let's say you work from 9 to 5. When you leave work at 5 o'clock, the rest of the time in the day or on the weekends is yours to do with as you want. So if you want to do work related development, you can do that. But if you want to go for a run, you want to spend time with your family, you want to spend time with friends, you want to read a book, you want to watch TV, you want to paint, whatever it may be, that time is yours. But when you're a graduate student, it feels like your time is never yours, right? So it's maybe you've got a placement or a job you do in the morning and afternoon. Maybe your classes are in the evening. Maybe your class is in the day, but in the evening you're having to read research articles for the next day's class, work on papers, things like that. You might get emails in the middle of the night or late at night or late in the evening telling you to do a thing or make adjustments to your dissertation or your thesis, things like that. It just feels like there are boundary issues, that you're always on the clock, you're always working, and you never get a real break or time away from that. And that can be extremely stressful. And if you're never recovering, if you're never on the clock, that moves you closer and closer to burnout. Dissertation and thesis, right? So when you're an undergrad, you're writing these 2-page papers, these 5-page papers, things like that. And then when you start to study for your master's or your doctorate, those 5-page papers become 10-page papers, which become 20-page papers, which for some people move to the level of dissertation, which means you're moving into a three-figure page document in what is considered like a small book. You are literally making a unique contribution to your field, quote unquote. And that can be a huge stress, especially with some of the misnomers about like dissertation and thesis, such as like that has to be a big contribution and things like that. There's so much haze that surrounds the process, and it is for many, if not most people, the most intensive thing they will ever write. You might get a lot of edits, you might get a lot of pushback from the people editing, so it feels like there's just this never-ending string of failure tied up with it, or criticism or whatever, and that is naturally going to be a very stressful process. And then it's one of those things that feels like it never ends. It does end eventually, but that's hard to be mindful of when you're in the middle of it, right? Another grad school concern, or I think unique to grad school, is increased academic demands. Yes, undergrad work can be difficult, and it varies very strongly by professor. But let's be honest, when you go to grad school, typically what you are asked to do increases. So for instance, instead of reading a textbook, which sort of boils down the material to the basics of what you need and makes it very reasonable, you start reading for your class's primary sources, where you're the one that has to disseminate what it means. You're the one that has to interpret what it means and things like that. So it becomes much more demanding. Think about the paper length we just talked about, right? Instead of writing a 2-page paper or 5-page paper, you might be expected to write 10 or 20-page papers with decent amount of frequency. It's just more demanding. I think along those lines, then we see a buildup for grad students of school fatigue. When you graduate, if you talk about someone who goes to school right out of high school, let's say, right? They're typically going to graduate around age 21, 22, 23, something like that. Again, this is once again going back to it differs for everybody, and that's a huge theme of this. But typically, a college undergraduate ends their journey at, let's say, 21, 22, something like that. By the time you get out of grad school, depending on your program, you might be approaching your 30s, you might be in your early 30s. I was a non-traditional student, so I went back to school later in life. But so it's a little different for me, but typically, like a doctoral candidate might not come out till their early 30s, or a med school candidate or something like that. So by that point, school's what you've done your entire life, and you've had almost 30 years doing it, or something approaching that, 25 years doing it. And there's probably a much higher chance that you have fatigue for it and you want to get out into the world and make money, and that just wears you down. Similarly, another source of that kind of stress is loan buildup. Undergraduates have loans, they can be very expensive. So imagine adding another 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, whatever it may be, onto that. Now the debt is, once again, a higher level source of stress and that kind of thing. And then the last thing I think is really unique to grad school in particular is the potential for having to move around, right? So you may not necessarily, like you might move for undergrad, but you might have to move again to go to grad school. You might move for internship, and then you might move again for a job. Maybe you move between a master's program and a doctoral program if you decide to make that choice. So there is the potential for more opportunities where you pack up your house, you move, you have to unpack, which can be very time consuming, very stressful, can be very expensive depending on how you need to move and things like that, and putting down payments down on a new place or whatever it may be, deposits, things like that. So again, something that just increases the potential for more of that hardship and more of that stress. So let's kind of touch on some of the more general ones now. So those are the ones we just talked about were the things that I think are more kind of specific to the grad school experience. These are going to be, I think, a little more general. So we'll try to zip through them a little bit faster, but lack of time, right? In grad school, sometimes it just feels like you don't have enough time to get things done. So, hey, you've got these assignments and papers you have to write, or you need to teach a class, or you need to grade your students' assignments, things like that if you're teaching a course, and it just doesn't feel like there's enough time. And that is, of course, very, very stressful, to feel like you just don't have enough time to accomplish all the tasks. Some programs, or even some places that you'll eventually go on to work at, will have very cumbersome rules. So there might be like a bureaucracy. This can be true in the grad school experience. Some schools, some programs, some departments can be that way, can be very cumbersome to try to navigate what you've got to do and all the paperwork you've got to get done to graduate or pass your comprehensive exams or complete your thesis or dissertation. And other programs might be great about it. So again, this is very much something that varies, but this can be the experience for some students. And this can also be a problem in places you work. High self-expectations. I think this one comes from a good place, in that I think grad students tend to be good students overall. They're high achievers, which means they set a high expectation of themselves, which is fantastic. But sometimes our greatest strengths also become our greatest weaknesses, because when we set a high self-expectation, if we're afraid we're not going to meet it, that can transform into anxiety, and that can make the experience much more difficult. So when you're in an environment with high demand and high self-expectation, that can be a recipe for a lot of stress and ultimately burnout, right? That pressure we put on ourselves. So it's not just that a program is putting pressure on us, or that they expect more out of us, because they do. It's that we expect more out of ourselves too. So we become a source of stress for ourselves. Unclear institutional expectations, right? So not only can sometimes navigating a department or a program be cumbersome, it can also be unclear. And I think a lot of us like clarity. We want to know, what are the check boxes we've got to check off to finish or do what we need to do, or take the classes that we need to take and things like that. And if you don't have clear expectations, it can a lot of times feel like we're not getting the support that we need. And that can be incredibly stressful if you feel like you're navigating this very difficult experience, but you don't have the support that you need to properly navigate it. I think almost every graduate student can relate to the idea of low salary or low financial support. Graduate school for a lot of people is an experience in which you make just enough money to starve to death. Funding can vary wildly among programs. Some programs are very well funded where the graduate student's tuition is waived or offset. For some, they get partial funding, and for other graduate programs, they don't get funding at all. And it's literally entirely done through loans and things like that. So it varies wildly, but no matter which of those options you have, there's a very good chance you're not going to have a lot of money. You're not going to have a lot of financial support. And financial support just in the world at large is one of the biggest sources of stress and anxiety and even interpersonal conflict among couples that we see in psychology. So that can be a huge source of stress. Lack of community feel. How do you get along with your department? How do you get along with the faculty? How do you get along with your cohort? A cohort that gets along really well can be a huge source of support. And a cohort that does not get along very well can be a huge source of stress. And the same can be true of the support you get from your front office or the faculty in your specific department that you're in and things like that. When there's a community feel, it can be really good. And when there isn't, if there's a lot of like dissension among faculty and things like that, it can become a very stressful and difficult environment in which to try to navigate those landmines, and that can be very stressful. I think another really good general one is problems at home. Who hasn't had problems at home sometimes? And this can look so many different ways for so many different people. So you're at school, you're teaching, you're writing, you're in a research lab, you're doing all these things. It's very stressful, and you come home and maybe you're having problems with a significant other, or maybe there's a medical issue with your pet, or maybe you have kids and there's something up with your kids and your kids are struggling in school, or maybe you're having trouble paying your rent, or maybe a relative is sick and things like that. Problems at home can be any number of different things, but it just, again, it's one of those things that can drain you and leave you with less resources to deal with what's going on. Feeling undervalued. Sometimes grad students feel like they're cheap labor. And that can be a harsh way to put it, but sometimes they don't feel like they're valued for the contribution that they make to the university, to their departments and things like that. And that leads to feeling undervalued. And who wants to feel undervalued? Who likes feeling undervalued? Everybody wants to feel like they're seen, they're heard, and that their commitment and their contribution is recognized and valued. I think heavy workload is a pretty typical one that we see just in the, and we've talked about this before, just the heavy demands of grad school. Writing longer papers, writing higher quality work, teaching, things like that just creates more work and more difficult work. Another thing that could lead you to stress or burnout in grad school is if you have a history coming in of mental health problems, or if those things develop. Anxiety, depression, sleep issues. There's so many of these things that can exacerbate or make the graduate school experience far more difficult. In a very similar way, a history of health problems could make graduate school so much more difficult than originally is. And then last and certainly not least are cultural and identity factors. If you think about what's going on in our world right now, it's pretty reasonable to imagine that if you don't feel your identities are supported, they're valued, they're heard, if you feel they're targeted, if you feel they don't have access to full rights, and all those types of things, that's of course going to take a gigantic toll and make an already difficult experience nigh impossible or so much more difficult. Those cultural and identity factors matter so much, and it's taken too long for us to realize it, and we're not where we need to be, and we need to understand that those things make a gigantic difference. Belonging matters for sure. So that is a huge list, and there's still too many things to list, way too many things to list. But I think it's important to remember that every single one of these things we just talked about can be reframed from the idea of a conflict between demands and resources, right? That what is being demanded of us is too high, and or the resources that we have to meet those demands are too low. So every single one of these things could be reframed that way. So take lack of time. Lack of time is you don't have enough resources available to you, the resource in that case being time. Or let's say heavy workload. That's just the demands are too high. You may have really good resources. You may be full of energy, but if you have too heavy of a workload, there are too many demands. Let's go back to dissertation. It could be a thesis or a dissertation could literally be reframed as both of those things. The demands being placed on you to write a dissertation or a thesis feel too high, and maybe with everything else going on in your life, your resources are too low. So if you think about all of these things, try to consider them from the standpoint of this is a conflict between demands and resources. So now that I've done an adequate job of completely and totally stressing you out about how miserable grad school is, what can you do about it? The first thing I want to say is you have agency. And remember, positive changes don't just happen on their own. If you wait for the perfect time for something to happen, you're going to be waiting forever. You have agency to be the change you want to see. And I think that's really important, okay? So let's talk about first long-term strategies for managing stress and burnout in grad school, okay? And I would like you to try to view this from the lens of all of these from the lens of that these can be different for everyone. That's a theme we're going to go back to. So know your patterns and know yourself, okay? There is no exact, precise answer. There is no one size fits all for everyone. So it is about finding what works for you specifically, and it can look very different from you than it does the person sitting next to you in class. Those can be wildly different things that work, but it's important to know your patterns and know yourself to be able to apply these things, okay? So let's start with something that your grandmother might tell you to do. Let's start with very basic things like sleep, okay? Typically, we hear the amount of sleep that you need is 7 to 8 hours, but this is a perfect example of mileage may vary. It differs for everyone, right? That you will probably know at least one person in your life who all they need is 5 or 6 hours of sleep a night to feel totally and completely refreshed in the morning. And you will probably know at least one person in your life who they need 10 hours of sleep every night to feel completely refreshed. So the trick here is finding the number for you. What is your number? What is the number of hours of sleep you need every night to feel refreshed? Maybe higher, maybe lower, but trying to find that number. Also, when it comes to sleep, your body wants regularity. Your body is constantly looking to stay in a state of what is known as homeostasis or kind of stability, let's say, right? So that means your body prefers to go to sleep at the same time every night and to wake up at the same time every morning. You've probably heard sometimes of people saying that they are able to wake up without an alarm clock. That comes from that sleep stability. But when we're graduate students, we have a tendency to kind of, quote, go hard on it. And so we maybe go to bed late, and then we maybe have to get up later and things like that during the week. Or maybe we go to bed late and get up early during the week is maybe even more likely. And then we try to, quote unquote, catch up on the weekends and sleep more. And that makes our sleep patterns very chaotic. So we want to try to make them as stable as we can and get that same number and those same go to bed and wake up times every night. Eating. Everybody's dietary requirements are going to be different. So again, no one size fits all, but it's finding what works best for you. What do you need in terms of eating? How many meals are optimal for you? 2 meals, 3 meals, 4 meals, probably depends on what you're trying to do. And then what the combination of different food groups and things like that is different for everybody. But finding that for you is important. kind of that idea of the old phrase, you are what you eat. Like the fuel you put in, you will have a gigantic effect on how you feel. Exercise is another one of those things. And exercise, again, can look very different for very different people. So for some people, exercise means weightlifting, bodybuilding, things like that. Exercise for others might be cycling, it might be yoga, it might just be going for a walk. Exercise can be as simple as, well, I could drive to Starbucks or I could walk, or I could take the stairs or I could take the elevator, kind of a thing. So exercise looks different for different people. It depends on what kind of time you have, what facilities you do or do not have available to you, ableness, things like that. But finding what works for you and making that a regular part of your life to take care of your body. If you take care of your body and your mind are obviously connected and in constant concert. So that matters. Substance use, right? So what's the right amount of drinking? What's the right amount of kind of chemical usage? And like, for instance, take caffeine. That's a good example of knowing the right number for you. So a lot of grad students love coffee, helps us in the morning and all that kind of stuff. But is there a point that it makes sense to cut that off? Too much caffeine intake can exacerbate anxiety. It can exacerbate stress. It can impact your sleep. Even if you're able to get to sleep, it can make for more restless sleep. So is there a time of the day, say 10 o'clock, noon, 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock, whatever it may be, that you have to cut off caffeine usage? Or is there a number of beverages? I can have 2 cups of coffee, but anything more than that, I get jittery, things like that. What's the right number for you with those types of things? And then the last most basic thing is attitude. Happiness in life tends to be based on expectation. So if your expectation is that you'll be happy if you live in $1 million home and you drive a Ferrari, you're probably not going to be happy very often. So if you set a more manageable and reasonable expectation, you have a much better chance of meeting it and a much better chance of being happy. I would encourage you to challenge yourself about your attitude. Over the course of a grad school career, you are invariably going to be asked to do tasks you don't want to do or work with people you may not get along with or don't want to work with. I would strongly encourage you to challenge yourself in terms of your attitude. In terms of, that doesn't mean to generate sort of a false enthusiasm, but just reframe what's going on of, okay, I'm not into this project, but I'm going to give it my absolute best. I'm going to contribute in the best way I can, and then move on when it's over, and kind of do that kind of thing. And that reframing can be very, very helpful in keeping you healthy. So we talked about the idea of demands versus resources, that every stressor that is involved in grad student stress and ultimately burnout is this sort of push and pull between demands and resources. So what if we looked at it from the idea of ways to either decrease the demands or increase resources? So let's start with that in mind of how can you reduce the school or organizational demands on you, right? Well, one of the things you can do is have a conversation with your department chair, your committee chair, your dissertation chair, a boss where you work, a supervisor at a prac site or at a lab you might work in, or whatever it may be. Have a conversation with those people and let them know what's going on. And this next one, ask for a decreased workload. I think we're always very hopeful that the people in positions of authority in our life will notice those things and will do it, but they may not be watching, they may not notice, that kind of thing. And so we have a much better chance of getting what we need if we directly ask and we directly have a conversation. That doesn't mean when you have the conversation, you'll necessarily get that, but you can't know until you ask. So one of the best things you can do for that to sort of lower or reduce the demands on you is to ask for a reduction in the demands, wherever they may come from. Another area to that, or an alternative to that, is adjust or change up where you have responsibilities, right? So if you fill, for instance, one role in the lab or you do one job in the department, one of the things that can help is to, what if you took on a different responsibility in the lab and you traded with somebody and things like that? That can help keep things fresh, It can reduce the demands a little bit. It can just make things a little bit easier. I think you'll notice that adjusting or changing up things, changing the look of things, coming at things from a different angle can be very helpful. This is a huge one, and this probably seems like an impossibility, but one of the most important things you can do in grad school, and one of the most important things you will need to know how to do in your professional life, is learn to say no. It probably feels like for some people that's an impossibility when they're in grad school, because they're maybe not in a position of power or authority, obviously, but one of the most important things is to be able to say no. I think we have a natural tendency to try to take on a lot. We sometimes are achievers by nature. We want to take full advantage of the growth opportunities placed in front of us, but sometimes we just need to say that, like someone says, hey, I've got a lab opening, it'd be really great to have you. It's just, yeah, I'd love to, but I just have too much on my plate right now. And learning what our limitations are. So it goes back to the know yourself, know your patterns, know your limitations, and know when enough is enough. And the other thing is consider a move to a different workplace or environment, and particularly the idea of fit. So when you're looking at if you're going from a master's program to a doctoral program, or from a doctoral program to maybe an internship or your first job or a postdoc or whatever it may be, consider the possibility of fit. Sometimes we're sort of culturally programmed to believe that the more money we can make, the better. But the problem is, if you don't like the environment you work in, you cannot buy enough things and you cannot go on enough vacations to outrun the fact that the job you do not like or the environment you don't like will still be waiting for you when you get back from that European vacation or whatever it is. So having an environment that you like and coworkers that you like can really matter. And sometimes that might be worth taking a little bit less money for and things like that. So consider how fit works for you and what might be a good fit for you. So now that we've talked about reducing demands, let's talk about how to increase resources. So coming at it from sort of the other side of this push and pull that we see. So one way to increase your own personal resources is take a break. I know that seems super basic, but I think we sometimes forget to do that, right? So just either walk away, schedule breaks into your day, things like that. So if you've been writing on a paper for a couple hours, go take a walk, go work out, go watch TV, go read a book, go do something like that. Or instead of just completely taking a break, downshift to a less demanding task. So if you're studying for your comprehensive exams, maybe downshift to something less demanding, like a one-page reflection paper that you've got due in a class that's really maybe not a big deal, or something like that. Something along those lines. Change it up, reduce the amount you've got to do for a while, take those breaks, let yourself recharge. If you're constantly pulling on your resources, if you're constantly draining your resources, eventually that will lead to burnout. It's like a car. Eventually the car's got to go to the gas station. It has to be refilled. It can't drive forever. Another big way to increase your resources is just peer and classmate support, right? No one can understand the graduate school experience better than people who have been through it. And no one can understand your personal experience better than some of your classmates or department mates or lab mates or cohort mates, whatever it may be. So you can empathize with one another. If you have frustration with a certain demand or a certain assignment or a certain professor, whatever it may be, no one will know better than that. And if you check in on them and they check in on you, that can be very helpful for just sort of increasing those resources, that you don't feel alone in it anymore. Try a different modality of working. Try working a different way, or if you teach, observe a peer. So if you teach a class and you always do lecture, watch one of your classmates teach. Maybe they do discussion or they do activity-based learning. Try that. Switch it up. Come at it from a different angle. That can help keep things fresh. It can help keep things new. So similarly, learn something new. So you're always going to want to stay current in your field and engage in professional development, but maybe learn something adjacent to what you normally would do. So it's a little newer, it's a little fresher, it engages a different part of your brain. Or mentoring. So not just being mentored, let's say by faculty, but mentoring a new student. that that puts you in a very different position or a very different mindset. So instead of being the learner, you're the mentor, and it just can put your mind in a different place and give you that sense of increased resources. Another huge one, set boundaries, okay? Spend time with non-work and school friends, because a lot of times when we get together with cohort mates, there can be a tendency to the only thing we talk about are school related or department related things. Kind of that, oh my gosh, I can't believe Professor so-and-so wants this, or oh, these comps are crazy, or dissertation, all that kind of stuff. We have a tendency to fall into those patterns. So it can be very helpful to get out of the grad school bubble and spend time with non-work school friends, family members, stuff like that. Or if you're with members of your cohort or coworkers, talk about things other than school. It's totally cool to complain a little bit about what's going on in the department. There's no question, or an assignment you all have or something like that. But maybe it's a good idea to limit that talk to a half hour, if you go out for drinks or something like that, and make a choice to talk about non-school things. That way it's not constantly a source of stress or pressure. Also have some alone time. That can be very helpful too. To be able to do those other things and not always have to be on all the time socially. Unplug, step away from devices and social media. I know that's really hard to do in our world today because we have our phones with us all the time and we're constantly getting notifications and stuff like that, but step away for a while. Go work out, go for a walk, read a book and mute it, turn it off, turn it over for a while, get away from it. Find your passions in and out of school. So I assume by the time you're in grad school, you have a sense of what some of your professional passions are, but also remember that your passions outside of school matter too. Those are the things that will recharge you. So not only find those things, but spend time doing them. And those could be anything. It could be learning a new language, playing guitar, singing, dancing, painting, crocheting, exercising, spending time with friends, playing video games, playing board games. It doesn't really matter what it is, writing, it could be anything, but find those things that make you feel good, make you feel like you have energy, and literally make them a part of your everyday life. That's important. And schedule them into your life, like the next point. So know your patterns. When are you most productive? If you're most productive from 10 a.m. to noon, you should schedule your most important work of the day from 10 a.m. to noon if you're able. If you're least productive from, say, 4 to 6, then you don't want your most important work of the day to be from 4 to 6. Also, it can be helpful to actually just schedule free time. That matters. You've got to recharge your batteries. So sometimes it gets to a point where you're not just naturally taking time out for yourself. So schedule that time for yourself, right? And then, of course, I would be doing a huge disservice to student counseling if I didn't shamelessly plug my own profession, which is obviously mental health counseling and therapy. You have services available to you. There's a grad student support group that is directly for grad students only. There are individual counselors that can work with you and all that kind of stuff. So if it feels like it's becoming too much, if it feels like it would be good to have a confidential and entirely private space to talk about those things, it is literally just a phone call away. So I would encourage you, if that would be helpful, to consider that as a possibility too. Okay, so we talked about the long-term strategies. Let's very briefly touch on the short-term strategies. So these are things you can do in the moment, right? So when you feel stressed, stress is a physiological response. So consider something like 4 square breathing, right? That's where you breathe in for 4 seconds, you hold the breath for 4 seconds, you breathe out for 4 seconds, and you hold that for 4 seconds. And I'm not talking about 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean a long 1001, 1002, 1003, those types of things. That brings your breathing down, bringing your breath rate down, brings your heart rate down, which will sort of help get you out of that anxious state, right? Mindfulness meditation, you see a lot of these on like YouTube, of just this idea of imagining you're sitting next to a stream and there are leaves floating on the top of the stream, and those leaves are your thoughts. So do you choose to pluck those thoughts off the top of the stream or out of your stream of consciousness and obsess over them, or do you choose to instead Just let them go by, accept them and let them flow by. So there are a lot of those that you can find on YouTube. There are a lot of mindfulness and relaxation exercises. You can find free ones on these websites. There are a lot of mindfulness apps that do the same thing. There's some of them listed here. I know Calm is a really hot one right now that's getting a lot of downloads and things like that. But these are all things that are some are paid, some are free, that are available to you, and just things you can use in the short term. You can do them when you're on a prac site, you can do them in the classroom. No one will know you're doing some of these, so they can be very helpful in the short term to go along with those more long-term strategies that we talked about, okay? So of course, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to reach out to me personally, or you could reach out to people at the Student Counseling Center or other people you trust about that kind of stuff. I want to thank you so much for having me today. I know I have thrown a lot at you, so deep breath. I threw so much at you in a short amount of time, but remember, you are not alone in this. There are strategies to make it better, and there are those of us in the world that our very profession is to try to help make it better, okay? So thank you again for your time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.